I was 8 months pregnant, my belly so swollen I could barely fit behind the steering wheel, when my landlord threw my belongings onto the rain-soaked sidewalk and changed the locks while I was at my minimum wage cashier job. "Babies aren't welcome here," she'd said coldly when I'd given her the news 3 months earlier, her perfectly manicured hand already drafting the eviction notice despite my perfect payment history and the lease that had 6 months remaining. I had no idea that the woman who left me homeless and terrified, sleeping in my decade-old sedan in a grocery store parking lot while my daughter kicked against my ribs, would one day stand in my office with tears streaming down her face, begging me for the very thing she'd once denied me: mercy. Before we dive into this incredible story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I always love seeing our global community come together. If you enjoy stories about karma, justice, and how life has a way of evening the scales, make sure to hit that like button right now and subscribe to our channel so you never miss these inspiring true stories. Now, let me take you back to that devastating autumn day 5 years ago when I was just a 25-year-old woman trying to survive on $9 an hour, carrying a baby whose father had disappeared the moment he saw those 2 pink lines, with no family to turn to, and a landlord who saw my pregnancy as nothing more than an inconvenience to her property investment. My name is Sarah Chen, and that autumn 5 years ago, I was working the evening shift at Save Mart, scanning groceries with hands that had started swelling from pregnancy, while my feet throbbed in shoes that no longer fit properly. I'd been living in that small one-bedroom apartment on Maple Street for 2 years, never late with rent, never causing problems, quietly existing in a building that housed mostly elderly tenants and a few young professionals who kept to themselves. The apartment wasn't much. Outdated kitchen, a bathroom with tiles that had seen better days, windows that rattled when the wind picked up. But it was mine. Or at least it had felt that way until I'd knocked on Mrs. Patricia Whitmore's door to inform her that I was pregnant and would be having a baby in December. Patricia Whitmore was exactly the kind of landlord you hope to avoid. A woman in her late 50s who wore expensive suits even when collecting rent. Who drove a Mercedes that she parked in the space closest to the building entrance. Who spoke about maintaining property values and tenant quality, as if people were commodities to be assessed and discarded. She owned 3 buildings in our neighborhood, all purchased during her marriage to a successful real estate developer, and she managed them with an iron fist wrapped in a veneer of professional courtesy. I'd always paid my rent on time, left money orders in her mailbox by the 1st of every month, kept my apartment clean and quiet, followed every rule in the lease agreement that I'd signed with hope and relief when I'd finally escaped my previous situation. The previous situation I'd escaped was a relationship with Marcus, a man I'd met during my brief semester at community college before financial aid ran out, and I'd had to drop out to work full-time. Marcus had seemed charming at first, ambitious, full of plans for a future that included both of us. But charm faded quickly into control. Ambition revealed itself as entitlement, and plans became demands that I couldn't meet. When I'd discovered I was pregnant, I'd felt a complicated mix of fear and hope. Fear of doing this alone. Hope that maybe a baby would change things, would make him grow up and take responsibility. Instead, Marcus had looked at me with something close to disgust and said, "That's your problem, not mine," before blocking my number and moving to another state. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that he was bartending in Arizona, living with a new girlfriend. Pretending our relationship and the baby growing inside me had never existed. So there I was, 25 years old, alone, working a job that barely covered my expenses, carrying a daughter I already loved desperately despite the fear that kept me awake at night. I'd been managing, just barely, calculating every dollar, eating cheap meals, skipping things I needed to save for things the baby would need. I'd found a used crib at a thrift store, had been slowly accumulating tiny clothes from clearance sales, had signed up for every assistance program I qualified for. My plan was simple: work until the last possible moment, take the unpaid maternity leave SaveMart was required to give me under FMLA, live on my savings and whatever assistance I could get for 12 weeks, then return to work and figure out affordable childcare somehow. It wasn't a great plan, but it was a plan, and I'd been holding on to it like a lifeline. When I'd told Mrs. Whitmore about the pregnancy, I'd expected maybe some congratulations, or at least neutral acknowledgement. What I hadn't expected was the way her expression had hardened, the way she'd looked at me as if I'd just informed her of my intention to commit a crime on her property. "A baby," she'd repeated, her voice flat and cold. "Miss Chen, you're aware that this is a quiet building. My tenants expect a certain standard of living. Babies cry. They disturb other residents. They cause damage. Frankly, this building isn't suitable for children, and I don't believe you're in a position to provide appropriate care while maintaining your obligations as a tenant." I'd stood there in her doorway, my hand unconsciously moving to my barely visible belly, trying to process what she was saying. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm a good tenant. I've never caused any problems. I'll make sure the baby doesn't disturb anyone. The lease you signed specifies that any significant change in occupancy must be approved by the landlord," she'd interrupted, pulling out a copy of my lease agreement with tabs already marking the relevant sections. "A baby constitutes a significant change. I'm denying approval. You'll need to find alternative housing before the child is born. I'm giving you 90 days notice, which is more than generous considering the circumstances." I'd tried to argue, tried to point out that there was no clause specifically prohibiting children, that housing discrimination based on familial status was illegal, but Mrs. Whitmore had simply smiled, a cold, professional smile that didn't reach her eyes, and said, "Miss Chen, I suggest you consult with an attorney if you believe your rights are being violated. In the meantime, you have 90 days. I'd recommend you use them wisely to secure appropriate housing for yourself and your child." But I didn't have money for an attorney. I barely had money for groceries. I'd spent the next 3 months searching desperately for another apartment I could afford. But everywhere I looked, landlords took one look at my pregnant belly and suddenly had no vacancies, or required deposits I couldn't pay, or had income requirements I didn't meet. Some were honest about their reluctance to rent to a single pregnant woman with a low-paying job. Others made excuses that were transparent in their discrimination but impossible to prove. As my belly grew and my due date approached, my options dwindled to nothing. I'd tried to talk to Mrs. Whitmore again, explaining my situation, begging for more time, offering to pay an additional deposit, promising to be the perfect tenant. She'd listened with that same cold smile and said, "Miss Chen, I've been more than patient. Your 90 days are up next week. If you're not out by Friday, I'll begin formal eviction proceedings, which will make it even harder for you to find housing in the future. I suggest you make arrangements." The thing was, I had nowhere to go. My parents had died in a car accident when I was 19, leaving me with nothing but debt from their medical bills and funeral expenses. I had no siblings, no extended family that I was close to, or that would take in a pregnant woman they barely knew. The few friends I'd had from high school had moved away or drifted apart over the years. Marcus's family wanted nothing to do with me or the baby. I'd looked into shelters, but the few that accepted pregnant women had waiting lists months long, and the thought of bringing my newborn daughter into a shelter environment made my heart break even as I filled out the applications. So on that Friday in late September, when I returned from my shift at SaveMart, I found all my belongings, my clothes, my few pieces of furniture, the baby items I'd so carefully collected, piled on the sidewalk in front of the building. It had started raining that afternoon, and everything was getting soaked. The locks had been changed. A notice was taped to the door informing me that I'd been evicted for violation of lease terms, and that any attempt to enter the property would be considered trespassing. I'd stood there in the rain, 8 months pregnant, watching my life dissolve into soggy cardboard boxes and ruined furniture, and I'd felt something inside me break and then immediately harden into determination. I couldn't fall apart. I had a daughter depending on me, a daughter who would be born in less than 2 months, who deserved a mother who fought for her even when everything seemed impossible. I'd loaded what I could fit into my car, a 2008 Honda Civic with 180,000 miles and a check engine light that had been on for 6 months. I'd had to leave behind the furniture, the crib, most of the baby clothes, things I'd worked so hard to acquire. I'd watched from my car as other tenants walked past my belongings without stopping, as Mrs. Whitmore's maintenance man eventually loaded everything into a dumpster. That night, I'd parked in the lot behind Save Mart, the store where I worked, where I knew the overnight security guard and thought I might be safe. I'd reclined the driver's seat as far as it would go, which wasn't far with all my remaining possessions packed into the back seat and trunk, and I'd tried to sleep while my daughter kicked and turned inside me, as if protesting our new accommodations. The temperature had dropped into the 40s that night, and I'd wrapped myself in every piece of clothing I had, shivering despite the layers, terrified and exhausted, and more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. My grandmother had raised me after my parents died. A tiny woman who'd immigrated from Taiwan with nothing and had worked as a seamstress for 40 years, who'd taught me that dignity wasn't about what you had, but about how you treated people, who'd shown me that kindness cost nothing but meant everything. She'd died 2 years before this, and I'd found myself wishing desperately that she was still alive, that I could hear her voice telling me that everything would be okay, that hard times didn't last forever. She'd always said, "Sarah, you have good heart. Good heart is worth more than full wallet. You remember this." I'd tried to remember it as I'd cried myself to sleep in that car, tried to believe that somehow my good heart would be enough to protect my daughter and give her the life she deserved. The weeks that followed had been a blur of survival and desperation. I'd continued working at Save Mart, showing up for every shift despite the exhaustion, despite the way my body ached and swelled, despite the humiliation of my coworkers gradually realizing that I was living in my car. I'd parked in different locations each night, trying to stay safe, trying to avoid police who might cite me for sleeping in my vehicle, trying to find places with public restrooms where I could wash up before work. I'd eaten whatever cheap food I could afford, knowing I needed to stay healthy for my baby, but unable to afford the nutritious meals I should have been eating. I'd gone to my prenatal appointments at the free clinic, where a kind nurse practitioner named Maria had looked at me with concern and asked gentle questions about my living situation, offering resources that I was already on waiting lists for or couldn't access. I'd applied for emergency housing assistance for every program and service available to pregnant women in crisis, but bureaucracy moved slowly, and my baby didn't care about processing times or eligibility requirements. I'd gone to churches and community organizations, sitting through intake interviews where well-meaning volunteers had taken down my information and promised to call when something became available, calls that rarely came or came too late. I'd felt invisible, like I was shouting into a void where no one could hear me, or worse, where people could hear me but chose to look away because my problem was too big, too complicated, too uncomfortable to address. There had been moments of kindness that had kept me going. Rosa, the night manager at Save Mart, had started accidentally preparing too much food from the deli and giving it to me at the end of my shifts. Warm meals that I'd eaten gratefully in my car, sometimes crying because someone had seen me and cared enough to help without making me feel ashamed. Miguel, the security guard, had let me park in the employee lot overnight and had never reported me, had even brought me a blanket one particularly cold night and told me his own story of being homeless years ago, of how he'd gotten through it, and how I would too. These small acts of compassion had been lifelines, reminders that not everyone was like Mrs. Whitmore, that there were still people in the world who saw struggling humans rather than inconvenient problems. But the cold reality was that I was running out of time. My due date was December 15th, just 6 weeks away, and I had no plan for what would happen when I went into labor, no safe place to bring my baby home to, no idea how I would manage to work and care for a newborn while living in my car. The fear was constant, a weight that pressed on my chest and made it hard to breathe, made worse by the knowledge that I was completely alone in this, that there was no one coming to save me, that everything depended on me somehow finding a solution to an impossible situation. It was during one of my prenatal appointments, 3 weeks before my due date, that Maria, the nurse practitioner, had sat down with me and said, "Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You cannot have this baby and live in your car. It's not safe, it's not legal, and Child Protective Services will take your daughter the moment they find out. I've been making calls, and I think I might have found something." She'd told me about a program run by a local nonprofit called Second Chances, which provided transitional housing for women in crisis. There was a room available in one of their shared houses, a place where I could stay for up to 6 months while I got on my feet, where I'd have support and resources, and most importantly, a safe place to bring my baby. I'd cried in that clinic room, overwhelmed with relief and gratitude, barely able to believe that someone had actually found a solution, that there might be a way forward. Maria had hugged me and said, "You're going to be okay. You're going to be a wonderful mother. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're not worthy of help, like you don't deserve safety and dignity. You do. You absolutely do." The house that Second Chances provided was nothing fancy. A converted Victorian in an older neighborhood, shared with 3 other women in similar situations, with house rules and chores and required participation in life skills workshops. But it was warm and safe. And mine. I'd moved in 2 weeks before my due date, bringing in the few possessions I'd been living with in my car, setting up the small room that would be mine and my daughter's, feeling for the first time in months like maybe I could actually do this, like maybe we would be okay. My daughter, Emma Rose Chen, had been born on December 18th, 3 days past her due date, after 16 hours of labor at County General Hospital. I'd labored alone. No partner or family to hold my hand or tell me I was doing great, just Maria who'd come on her day off to be with me, and a rotating cast of nurses who'd been kind and professional. When they'd finally placed Emma in my arms, tiny and perfect and screaming with healthy lungs, I'd looked at her face and made a promise. I would give her everything I'd never had. I would protect her from ever feeling unwanted or unworthy. I would build a life for us that was stable and secure, and full of love. The months at Second Chances had been transformative. The program had helped me find a better job, working as an administrative assistant at a law firm called Harrison & Associates, a small practice that specialized in tenant rights and housing discrimination. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd started as a receptionist, answering phones and filing papers, but I'd been hungry to learn, staying late to read case files, asking questions, absorbing everything I could about the law and how it worked. The senior partner, James Harrison, had noticed my interest and my work ethic, had started giving me more responsibilities, had encouraged me to take online classes toward finishing my degree. Emma had been the motivation for everything. Every time I'd wanted to give up, every time the exhaustion had felt overwhelming, every time I'd doubted whether I could actually build something better, I'd looked at her and found the strength to keep going. She'd been an easy baby, as if she'd understood somehow that we were in this together, that we needed to be a team. I'd brought her to work with me for the first 6 months, Mr. Harrison having agreed to let me set up a playpen in the corner of the office, and she'd charmed everyone with her quiet curiosity and ready smiles. By the time Emma was 2, I'd moved us out of the Second Chances house and into a small apartment of our own, nothing fancy but clean and safe and ours. I'd been promoted to paralegal, my salary finally enough to cover our expenses with a little left over for savings. I'd enrolled Emma in a good daycare, had started building a life that felt stable and hopeful. I'd finished my bachelor's degree online, taking classes at night after Emma went to bed, driven by a determination to never again be in a position where I couldn't support us, where someone like Mrs. Whitmore could destroy our lives with a single decision. Mr. Harrison had seen something in me, had mentored me through those years, had encouraged me to apply to law school. "Sarah," he'd said, "you have a natural understanding of the law and a passion for justice that can't be taught. You've lived the experiences of our clients. You understand what it means to be powerless and how the law can be used to protect or to harm. That makes you exactly the kind of lawyer we need more of." He'd written me letters of recommendation, had helped me prepare for the LSAT, had celebrated with me when I'd been accepted to the State University's evening law school program with a partial scholarship. Law school while working full-time and raising a toddler had been brutal. There had been nights when I'd studied until 2 in the morning and then been up again at 6 with Emma. Days when I'd felt like I was drowning in case law and legal theory and the constant pressure of trying to be enough for everyone who needed me. But I'd done it, had graduated in the top 10% of my class, had passed the bar exam on my first attempt, had been offered a position as an associate attorney at Harrison & Associates, the firm that had given me my first real chance. Now, 5 years after that night when I'd slept in my car, 8 months pregnant and terrified, I was 30 years old and a licensed attorney specializing in housing law. I had my own office, small but professional, with my law degree on the wall and photos of Emma on my desk. I had a comfortable apartment in a good neighborhood, a reliable car, savings in the bank, and most importantly, a daughter who was happy and healthy and secure, who would never know what it felt like to be unwanted or unsafe. I'd built this life from nothing, from the lowest point imaginable, through sheer determination and the kindness of people like Maria and Mr. Harrison who'd seen my potential when I'd been invisible to everyone else. My practice focused on representing tenants in housing discrimination cases, people who were being treated the way Mrs. Whitmore had treated me, people who had nowhere else to turn and no one else to fight for them. I took cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch, cases where the clients couldn't pay much or anything at all, cases where the principle mattered more than the profit. Mr. Harrison had built the firm on those values, and I'd embraced them completely, finding in the work a sense of purpose that went beyond just earning a living. Every client I helped, every landlord I held accountable, every family I kept from being displaced felt like a small redemption, a way of honoring what I'd survived and ensuring others didn't have to suffer the same injustice. It was a Tuesday morning in October, 5 years almost to the day after my eviction, when my assistant knocked on my office door and said, "Sarah, there's a woman here who doesn't have an appointment but says she desperately needs to speak with an attorney. She's pretty upset. Should I tell her she needs to schedule a consultation?" I'd been reviewing a case file, preparing for a hearing later that week, but something in my assistant's tone made me look up. "What's her situation?" "She says she's being evicted unfairly, that the new owner of her building is trying to force out all the longtime tenants to renovate and raise rents. She's been there for 15 years and can't afford to move. She's crying pretty hard." I'd felt that familiar pull, the one I always felt when I heard stories like this, the one that reminded me of sitting in my car at 8 months pregnant with nowhere to go. "Send her in. I'll talk to her." My assistant had nodded and left, and I'd straightened the papers on my desk, taken a sip of the coffee that had gone cold hours ago, prepared myself to hear another story of injustice and fear, another person whose home and security were being threatened by someone with more power and less compassion. I'd heard hundreds of these stories over the past 3 years, and each one still affected me, still made me angry and determined and grateful that I was in a position to help. The door had opened, and my assistant had stepped aside to let the potential client enter, and I'd looked up with a professional smile that had frozen on my face as I'd recognized the woman standing in my doorway. Patricia Whitmore looked nothing like the polished, confident landlord who'd evicted me 5 years ago. Her expensive suit had been replaced with clothes that were clean but worn. Her perfectly styled hair was gray and pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her face was lined with stress and tears, and her eyes held a desperation I recognized because I'd seen it in my own mirror during the worst days of my life. She'd stood there, clearly not recognizing me yet, seeing only a professional attorney in an office, someone who might be able to help her with the crisis that had brought her here. "Please sit down," I'd managed to say. my voice steady despite the shock and the complicated rush of emotions flooding through me. I gestured to the chair across from my desk, watching as she'd sat down heavily, clutching a folder of papers to her chest like a lifeline. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment," she'd said, her voice shaking. "I didn't know where else to go. I've been to 3 other law firms, and they all said they couldn't help me, or that it would cost more than I can afford, or that my case wasn't worth their time. I'm being evicted from my home, and I don't understand how this is legal, how they can just throw me out after 15 years of being a perfect tenant." The irony had been so sharp it had taken my breath away. I'd looked at this woman who'd once held all the power, who'd looked at my pregnant belly and decided I wasn't worth basic human decency, who'd left me homeless and terrified without a second thought, and I'd seen in her face the same fear and helplessness I'd felt that day. Life had a way of turning tables, of teaching lessons, of showing people what it felt like to be on the receiving end of the cruelty they'd once dispensed so easily. I'd taken a slow breath, centering myself, thinking about who I wanted to be in this moment, what kind of person I'd become despite everything she'd done to me. "Tell me what happened," I'd said quietly. "Start from the beginning." And Patricia Whitmore, not yet recognizing the pregnant woman she'd evicted in the professional attorney sitting across from her, had begun to tell her story. Her voice breaking with emotion, her hands trembling as she'd opened her folder of papers. "I owned 3 rental properties for 20 years, she'd started. They were my security, my retirement plan, everything I'd built during my marriage. But 5 years ago, my husband divorced me, and the settlement wasn't what I'd expected. I had to sell 2 of the buildings to pay him his share, and I kept just 1, the building I'd been living in myself for the past 15 years. I thought I'd be okay, that the rental income from the other units would be enough, but then the property taxes went up, and there were repairs I couldn't afford, and I fell behind on the mortgage." She'd continued, explaining how the bank had foreclosed on the building 6 months ago, how a real estate investment company had bought it at auction, how the new owners were renovating and converting it to luxury condos, how they'd given all the tenants 60 days to vacate, how she'd tried to fight it but couldn't afford a lawyer, how she was going to be homeless in 2 weeks because she couldn't find anywhere else she could afford to live on her fixed income. I'd listened to every word, watching her cry, watching her beg for help, watching her experience the same terror and helplessness she'd once inflicted on me without mercy. Part of me had wanted to feel satisfaction, to enjoy the justice of seeing her suffer the way she'd made me suffer. But as I'd listened, as I'd watched this woman who'd once seemed so powerful reduced to the same desperate state I'd been in, I'd felt something else entirely. A deep, aching sadness at how easily any of us could fall. How quickly circumstances could change, how little separated the powerful from the powerless, except luck and circumstance. When she'd finished her story, she'd looked at me with desperate hope and said, "Can you help me? Please? I know I don't have much money to pay you, but I can make payments. I can work something out. I just need someone to fight for me, to tell me this isn't legal, to help me keep my home. I'm 58 years old, and I have nowhere else to go. I can't be homeless. I can't." The word homeless had hung in the air between us, and I'd seen the moment when something in her expression had changed, when she'd really looked at me for the first time, when recognition had begun to dawn in her eyes. She'd gone very still, her face paling, her mouth opening slightly as she'd stared at me. As the pieces had come together in her mind. "Sarah Chen," she'd whispered, and it hadn't been a question. "You're Sarah Chen, the girl I evicted. You were pregnant. You were living in your car." "Oh my God." I'd nodded slowly, holding her gaze, letting her see me fully, letting her understand exactly who she'd come to for help. "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm Sarah Chen. The woman you evicted when I was 8 months pregnant because you didn't want a baby in your building. The woman whose belongings you threw out in the rain. The woman you left homeless with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. That's me." The color had drained completely from her face, and she'd started to stand, to gather her papers, her hands shaking so badly that papers had fallen to the floor. "I'm sorry," she'd said, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have come here. I'll go. I'll find someone else. I'm sorry." But I'd held up my hand, stopping her. "Mrs. Whitmore, sit down. Please." She'd frozen, looking at me with confusion and fear, clearly expecting me to throw her out, to tell her exactly what she deserved to hear, to refuse to help her the way she'd refused to help me. And I could have done that. I could have told her that karma had finally caught up with her, that she was experiencing the consequences of her own cruelty, that she deserved every bit of suffering she was going through. I could have enjoyed watching her beg and then turned her away, giving her a taste of the powerlessness and desperation she'd once inflicted on me without a second thought. But as I'd looked at her, I'd thought about my grandmother, about her words that good heart was worth more than full wallet, about how she'd always treated everyone with dignity regardless of their circumstances. I'd thought about Maria and Mr. Harrison and all the people who'd helped me when I'd had nothing to offer in return except gratitude. I'd thought about Emma, about the kind of mother I wanted to be, about the values I wanted to teach her, about the kind of world I wanted to help create where people lifted each other up instead of kicking each other when they were down. And I'd realized that this moment, this choice, would define who I'd become through all the struggle and growth of the past 5 years. I could choose to be the kind of person who held on to anger and sought revenge, or I could choose to be the kind of person who broke the cycle of cruelty with compassion, who offered help even to someone who'd once refused to help me, who understood that people could change and grow and deserve second chances because I'd needed and received second chances myself. "Mrs. Whitmore," I'd said quietly, "sit down. Let me look at your case. Let me see if there's anything I can do to help you." She'd stared at me as if I'd spoken a language she didn't understand, tears streaming down her face, her body trembling. "Why?" she'd whispered. "Why would you help me after what I did to you? I don't deserve your help. I was cruel to you. I left you homeless when you were pregnant. I didn't care what happened to you or your baby. Why would you possibly help me now?" I'd leaned forward, my hands folded on my desk, and I'd looked at her with complete honesty. Because 5 years ago, when I was at my lowest point, when I had nothing and nowhere to go, people helped me even though they didn't have to, even though I couldn't pay them back, even though helping me was inconvenient and difficult. They helped me because they saw a human being who needed help, and they chose compassion over indifference. They gave me a chance to survive, to build a life, to become someone who could help others. And now I'm in a position to do the same thing, to choose compassion over revenge, to help someone who needs it, even though they once refused to help me. I'd paused, letting my words sink in, watching her process what I was saying. "Mrs. Whitmore, what you did to me was wrong. It was cruel and it was illegal, and it caused me and my daughter tremendous suffering. I won't pretend otherwise. But I also won't become the kind of person who turns away someone in need just because they once turned away from me. That's not who I want to be. That's not the example I want to set for my daughter. So yes, I'll look at your case. I'll see if there's anything I can do to help you. Not because you deserve it, but because everyone deserves basic human dignity and the protection of the law, even people who've made terrible choices." Patricia Whitmore had broken down completely then, sobbing into her hands, her shoulders shaking, years of accumulated pain and regret and fear pouring out of her. "I'm so sorry," she'd said over and over. "I'm so sorry for what I did to you. I was wrong. I was so wrong. I didn't see you as a person, as someone with feelings and needs and rights. I only saw you as a problem, as something that would make my life more difficult. I didn't think about where you would go or what would happen to you. I didn't care, and I should have cared. I should have helped you. I should have been the kind of person who helped instead of hurt. I'm so sorry. I'd let her cry, had handed her tissues, had waited until she'd composed herself enough to continue. Then I'd spent the next 2 hours going through her case, reviewing her documents, asking questions, taking notes. The situation was complicated but not hopeless. The new owners had violated several procedures in their eviction process, had failed to provide proper notice, had made claims about the building's condition that weren't supported by inspection reports. There were grounds to challenge the eviction, to buy her time, possibly even to force a settlement that would give her enough money to relocate with dignity. I can help you, I'd finally said. I can file a motion to stay the eviction while we challenge the process. I can't promise we'll win, but I can promise I'll fight for you the way I wish someone had fought for me 5 years ago. My fee is $200 an hour, but for your case, I'll work for whatever you can afford to pay. We can set up a payment plan, or you can pay me when you're able. The important thing is keeping you housed and safe while we fight this. She'd looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, gratitude and shame and disbelief all mixed together. I don't understand how you can be so kind to me after what I did. Most people would want revenge. Most people would enjoy watching me suffer. I'd thought about that for a moment, about revenge and justice and the difference between them, about the kind of person I wanted to be and the kind of world I wanted to live in. Mrs. Whitmore, I'd said finally, revenge doesn't heal anything. It doesn't undo what was done or make anyone's life better. All it does is perpetuate cycles of harm. I spent a lot of time being angry at you, and that anger was valid and justified. But anger that just sits inside you and poisons your life doesn't serve any purpose. I chose to channel that anger into becoming someone who could prevent what happened to me from happening to others. I became a lawyer so I could fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Helping you isn't about you deserving it. It's about me being the kind of person I want to be. Over the following weeks, I'd thrown myself into Patricia Whitmore's case with the same intensity I brought to all my cases. I'd filed emergency motions, had appeared at hearings, had negotiated with the new building owner's attorneys, had documented every violation of tenant protection laws, had built a case that was strong enough to make them nervous about proceeding. The new owners hadn't expected resistance, had assumed that elderly tenants on fixed incomes would simply accept their evictions and move on, and they hadn't anticipated facing an attorney who understood housing law inside and out and who was willing to fight. Mrs. Whitmore had come to every meeting, every hearing, had watched me work with an expression of continued amazement and growing respect. We'd talked during those meetings, really talked, about what had happened 5 years ago, about her life and mine, about how people change and grow and sometimes get opportunities to make amends for past wrongs. She'd told me about her marriage falling apart, about how she'd built her identity around being successful and powerful, and how losing that had forced her to confront who she really was underneath the expensive suits and professional facade. I was so focused on property values and profit margins that I forgot about people, she'd said during one of our meetings. I saw tenants as sources of income or potential problems, not as human beings with lives and struggles and rights. I thought being a good landlord meant maintaining buildings and collecting rent on time. But I didn't understand that it also meant having compassion, understanding that people's homes are more than just investments, that the power I had over people's housing was a responsibility, not just an asset. She'd asked about Emma, about how we'd survived those early months, about where we'd lived and how I'd managed. I'd told her about second chances, about the people who'd helped me, about the long road from sleeping in my car to becoming an attorney. I'd shown her photos of Emma, now a bright, curious 5-year-old who loved books and art and asking questions about everything, who had no memory of those desperate early days, but who'd grown up hearing stories about resilience and kindness and the importance of helping others. "She's beautiful," Mrs. Whitmore had said, looking at the photos with tears in her eyes. I'm so glad you both made it. I'm so glad you survived what I did to you and built something beautiful from it. You're an amazing mother and an incredible person, and I don't deserve your help, but I'm grateful for it every single day. 3 months after she'd walked into my office, I'd negotiated a settlement that gave Mrs. Whitmore $60,000 in relocation assistance and 6 months to find new housing, enough money and time to transition with dignity instead of desperation. The new owners had agreed to the settlement to avoid a lengthy legal battle they might lose, and Mrs. Whitmore had cried when I'd called to tell her the news, had thanked me over and over, had asked how she could ever repay me for what I'd done. You don't need to repay me, I'd told her, but if you want to do something meaningful, take what you've learned from this experience and use it to treat people better going forward. Be the kind of person who helps instead of hurts. Be the kind of person who sees other people's humanity even when it's inconvenient. That's the only payment I want. But Mrs. Whitmore had wanted to do more. She'd used part of her settlement money to make a substantial donation to Second Chances, the program that had housed me when I'd had nowhere else to go. She'd started volunteering at a legal aid clinic, using her knowledge of property management to help tenants understand their rights. She'd written a letter to the editor of our local newspaper about her experience, about how she'd once been a landlord who'd prioritized profit over people, and how being on the other side had taught her about the real human cost of housing insecurity and the importance of treating tenants with dignity and compassion. We'd stayed in touch after her case was resolved, not quite friends, but something more than former adversaries. 2 women who'd been on opposite sides of a power dynamic and who'd both been changed by the experience. She'd told me that working with me had been one of the most humbling and transformative experiences of her life, that she'd spent years carrying guilt about what she'd done to me, and that my willingness to help her despite that had given her a kind of redemption she hadn't thought possible. You showed me what real strength looks like, she'd said during one of our last meetings. It's not about power or control or protecting yourself by hurting others. It's about choosing compassion even when you have every right to choose revenge. It's about being the kind of person who breaks cycles instead of perpetuating them. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met, and I'm honored that you gave me a chance to learn from you. Now, sitting in my office on a quiet afternoon, I thought about that journey from sleeping in my car to sitting behind this desk, from being powerless to being someone who could protect others from the same powerlessness I'd experienced. I thought about Emma, who was in kindergarten now, thriving and happy and secure, who would grow up knowing that her mother had faced impossible odds and had built something meaningful from nothing. I thought about all the clients I'd helped over the years, all the families I'd kept from being displaced, all the landlords I'd held accountable for treating people as disposable. And I thought about Patricia Whitmore, about how the universe had given me an opportunity for revenge, and I'd chosen compassion instead, about how that choice had been more powerful and more healing than any revenge could have been. She'd come to my office expecting judgment and rejection, the same things she'd once given me, and instead, she'd found mercy and help. And that unexpected grace had changed both of us in ways that punishment never could have. My grandmother had been right. Good heart was worth more than full wallet. The kindness I'd received from strangers when I'd had nothing had saved my life, and my daughter's life. And the kindness I'd chosen to give to someone who'd once hurt me had healed wounds I hadn't even realized I was still carrying. Every time I helped a client, every time I fought for someone who couldn't fight for themselves, every time I chose compassion over bitterness, I honored the people who'd helped me, and I created ripples of positive change that spread further than I could see. Emma had asked me once why I did the kind of work I did, why I helped people who sometimes couldn't pay me, why I spent so much time on cases that other lawyers wouldn't take. I'd told her the truth, that when I'd needed help, people had helped me, even though they didn't have to, and now it was my turn to help others, to be the kind of person who made the world a little bit better, a little bit kinder, a little bit more just. I'd told her that the most important thing in life wasn't how much money you made or how successful you became, but how you treated people, especially people who couldn't do anything for you in return. Being kind doesn't mean being weak, I'd explained to her. Sometimes being kind takes more courage than being cruel. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is help someone who's hurt you, forgive someone who's wronged you, choose compassion when everyone would understand if you chose anger instead. She'd thought about that, her 5-year-old face serious and thoughtful, and then she'd said, "Like how you helped the lady who was mean to us before I was born? The one who gave money to help other mommies and babies now?" "Exactly like that," I'd said, pulling her close. "That lady made a big mistake, and it hurt us a lot. But when she needed help, I chose to help her anyway, because that's the kind of person I want to be. And that's the kind of person I hope you'll grow up to be too. Someone who breaks cycles of hurt with kindness. Someone who makes things better instead of worse." The phone on my desk rang, pulling me back to the present moment. It was my assistant, letting me know that my next client had arrived. Another person facing eviction. Another story of injustice and fear. Another opportunity to use my skills and experience to make a difference. I straightened my desk, took a breath, and prepared to listen, to care, to fight. This was my life now, built from the ashes of that terrible time when I'd had nothing, when I'd been invisible and powerless and terrified. Every client I helped, every case I won, every family I kept housed and safe was a testament to the power of resilience, to the importance of compassion, to the truth that our worst moments don't have to define us, that we can choose who we become regardless of what's been done to us. Mrs. Whitmore had taught me something important, though not in the way she'd intended. She'd taught me that people who hurt others are often hurt themselves, that cruelty usually comes from fear or pain or a lack of understanding about what really matters. She'd taught me that everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow and become better, that redemption is possible even for people who've done terrible things. And most importantly, she'd taught me that choosing to help someone who's hurt you doesn't make you weak or foolish. It makes you powerful in a way that revenge never could. My grandmother would have been proud of the woman I'd become, of the mother I was to Emma, of the lawyer I was to my clients, of the person I'd chosen to be despite every reason I had to become bitter and angry and closed off. She would have understood why I'd helped Mrs. Whitmore, would have nodded her head and said, "Good heart, Sarah. You have good heart. This is what matters." And she would have been right, because at the end of the day, when everything else was stripped away, what mattered most was how we treated each other, how we responded to suffering, how we used whatever power we had to make the world a little bit better for the people around us. That was the legacy I wanted to leave for Emma, the lesson I hoped she'd carry with her throughout her life. That kindness wasn't weakness, that compassion wasn't foolishness, that choosing to help instead of hurt was the most powerful choice anyone could make. The door to my office opened, and my next client walked in, a young woman who looked exhausted and scared and desperate for someone to help her, someone to fight for her, someone to tell her that she mattered, and that her situation mattered, and that there were still people in the world who cared about justice and fairness and human dignity. I stood up to greet her, extending my hand, offering her a chair, preparing to listen to her story with the same care and attention I'd give to anyone who walked through my door. Because that's what my grandmother had taught me, what Maria and Mr. Harrison had shown me, what my own experience had proven to me, that we're all connected, that we all deserve dignity and respect and help when we need it, that the small choices we make every day about how we treat people add up to create the kind of world we live in. And I'd decided long ago what kind of world I wanted to create, what kind of person I wanted to be, what kind of legacy I wanted to leave for my daughter. I wanted to be someone who helped instead of hurt, who lifted instead of pushed down, who chose compassion over revenge every single time, even when it was hard, even when no one would blame me for choosing differently. Because that was the kind of person my grandmother had been, the kind of person Maria had been, the kind of person Mr. Harrison had been, and the kind of person I'd needed when I'd been at my lowest point. And now it was my turn to be that person for someone else. To be the help that I'd once needed. To be the hope that I'd once desperately searched for. To be proof that kindness wasn't wasted. That compassion created ripples that spread further than anyone could see. That choosing to be better instead of bitter could change not just one life, but many lives. Creating circles of healing that expanded outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. What an incredible journey from sleeping in my car while 8 months pregnant to sitting in my own office as an attorney who could protect others from the same injustice I'd faced. My story reminds us that our worst moments don't have to define us, that choosing compassion over revenge is the most powerful form of strength, and that the kindness we show to others, even those who've hurt us, creates ripples of positive change that extend far beyond what we can see. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have helped someone who'd once left you homeless and terrified? Have you ever had to choose between revenge and compassion, between protecting yourself and helping someone who didn't deserve it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective on these difficult choices we all face. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that true strength comes from choosing kindness even when we have every right to choose anger, please show your support by hitting that like button. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell so you never miss our inspiring stories about real people whose courage and compassion changed their lives and the lives of those around them. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.